Well, welcome everyone. I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at Holy Cross. And I'm pleased to join Professor Melissa Boyle of the Economics Department in hosting this year's Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar, Joseph Aldi. In a year when COVID-19 and political crises have diverted so much of our attention away from other pressing issues that haven't simply gone away, no magical thinking here, I'm grateful to have an opportunity to draw attention back to a hugely important issue, to climate change, and to be able to address a way forward. Professor Aldi, an economist and climate change policy expert, will speak to us today about US environmental policy, particularly carbon pricing programs, about his ideas about how we might save the planet cost effectively. I'll introduce Professor Aldi in a moment, but first I'd like to ask Professor Boyle to say a word about Phi Beta Kappa at Holy Cross.
Thanks, Tom. We're very fortunate to have Professor Joe Aldi with us this afternoon through the Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar Program. Phi Beta Kappa, the oldest academic honor society in the United States, is dedicated to honoring and advocating for excellence in the liberal arts and sciences. The Visiting Scholar Program was founded in 1956 and is designed to contribute to the intellectual life of colleges by giving undergraduates the opportunity to interact with some of the nation's top scholars. This program has allowed us to host Professor Aldi for a 2-day visit. And while we wish the visit could have been in person, we're making the best of our technology. In addition to this public lecture, Professor Aldi is spending time with students in smaller groups. He held a seminar this morning with a group of juniors and seniors to talk about how policymaking works in practice. And tomorrow he'll be speaking in several classes. We're grateful to the Visiting Scholar Program for the opportunity to host Professor Aldi here this week. And I will turn this back to Tom, who will introduce Professor Aldi to you.
Thanks, Melissa. As I mentioned earlier, I'm particularly pleased to welcome Joseph Aldi, whose research focuses on climate change policy, energy policy, and regulatory policy. He's professor of the practice of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, a university fellow at Resources for the Future, a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau for Economic Research, and a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He also serves as the faculty chair of the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government Regulatory Policy Program. From 2009 to 2010, he served as special assistant to President Obama for energy and environment at the White House. Professor Aldi previously served as co-director of the Harvard Project on International Climate Agreements, co-director of the International Energy Workshop, and worked with on the staff of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. After Professor Aldi's presentation, we'll open for audience questions. 2 Holy Cross students, Renee LeBlanc, a graduating political science and environmental studies double major who co-chairs EcoAction, the student environmental concern organization at Holy Cross, and Jo Jalbert, graduating economics major with a passion for statistics, will be with us as panelists. Renee will field the questions, so if you have questions you'd like her to pose to Professor Aldi, please submit them using the Q&A feature. The talk is being recorded and will be posted within a day or two on our website at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. So welcome, Professor Joe Aldi.
Great, thank you, Tom. And thanks to you and Melissa for the opportunity to be here, to the McFarland Center for hosting this session, and for the college for giving me the opportunity to at least visit with you over Zoom, if not in person. It would be a lot more fun to actually head west out of Cambridge and to join you in person, and hope we can do that in the not so distant future once we have COVID better managed here in Massachusetts and around the world. But I think also our experiences over the past year, thinking about how to deal with the kind of shock of a global pandemic, actually is a bit of a warning of what may be a future when we think about the risk posed by climate change. These are risks that will be felt throughout the world. These are risks that are characterized by some uncertainties, but the magnitudes of those risks could be quite dire, not unlike what we have been experiencing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, having said that, I am actually heartened by the increased enthusiasm both here in the United States, among the public, among key stakeholders, and now in government, as well as the interest around the world in taking on more and more aggressive action to tackle this problem. So I want to spend a few minutes here with you today sharing a presentation about how we think about tackling climate change, cost effectively. I will acknowledge at the beginning of the talk some of the daunting challenges we are facing when we think about the problem, but where I think there's also some opportunities to make progress in decarbonizing our economy, but also thinking more broadly, as I'll close in my remarks, about what may be a broader portfolio for managing the risk posed by climate change. So I'll start here by sharing my screen. I hope it comes up for everybody as we sort of think about how to save the planet cost effectively. And first, I'm going to frame this discussion with how we think about the challenge. Part of the challenge is looking at what has been happening, both in terms of the emissions of carbon dioxide, the leading greenhouse gas, and our policy efforts working with partners around the world to try to address and combat climate change. So what we've seen is, for the most part, going back to the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, but certainly since we've had fairly decent data measuring emissions of CO2 from around the world, for the most part, emissions have continued to grow over time, with the exception of a few events, often major economic disruptions. The oil shocks of the 1970s, the decline of manufacturing activity in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet bloc in the 1990s as we went through the transformation of the former Soviet bloc, the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, what we're actually seeing in terms of global emissions in the year 2020 because of COVID. With those exceptions excluded, we've typically seen the emissions of CO2 continue to grow globally, in part reflecting continued growth in our economies around the world and continued demand for energy, and especially fossil fuel energy. Despite tremendous improvements in the wind and solar and other renewable technologies that we've experienced over the past decade, fossil fuels still represent about 80% of the world's energy. What we can see, though, is that there have been a number of efforts globally, starting in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, where the world community came together for the first time to agree on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the governing agreement that has served as the basis for international negotiations on climate change since 1992. We had in 1997 the Kyoto Conference, the first time countries had so-called legally binding emissions commitments. We had in 2009 a Copenhagen Conference, the first time emerging economies and some developing countries had pledged to take efforts to mitigate their emissions. And then, of course, in 2015, we had Paris, the first time virtually the entire world pledged to reduce their emissions of CO2. So one of the frustrations that we've experienced, that we've had in each one of these agreements, in Rio in 92, in Kyoto in 97, Copenhagen in 09, Paris in 15, we've had countries come forward and say, we're going to reduce our emissions. And in fact, some of the goals that they set in Rio, in Kyoto, even in Copenhagen, a lot of these goals have been met, but we're still not doing enough to really bend the curve on emissions. And so that's one of the things that motivated the most recent effort in building the framework under the 2015 Paris Agreement, to ensure that we have both a broader agreement that's going to cover emissions across every country in the world, but also try to drive more ambitious emission reductions within each country and make that agreement a deeper, more substantial emission cutting agreement. And we'll see, I think, later this year at the next UN climate talks that will be held in Scotland in November, also in a number of I think, meetings that will occur in the lead up to Scotland, whether it's going to be the Climate Leaders Summit that President Biden wants to host this spring, or what may be some of the work that the UN will do over the course of the fall and the lead up to those climate talks in November. We're going to see a lot of discussion this year focused on enhancing the ambition and updating countries' pledges to mitigate their emissions. But so far, we've not really made, I think, a lot of headway in cutting emissions when we think about the challenge we face. Another way to illustrate that is the continued increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So since we've been monitoring at Mauna Loa out in Hawaii in the late 1950s, the concentration of CO2, we've seen it continue to grow. We've seen it go well beyond now 400 parts per million. And for that matter, what we've seen is that in recent decades, the concentration of CO2, the stock of CO2 in the atmosphere, is that stock, that total amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere that's driving the changes we're already starting to experience from climate change and will continue to drive changes of climate change going forward. That stock of CO2 is growing at an even faster rate in recent decades. So again, showing the challenge that we face and our lack of making sufficient progress in recent decades in dealing with that challenge. And as a result, what we've seen is warming that's becoming more and more pronounced. The question, I think, every year, at the end of a year is, Was last year the warmest on record, or maybe the second warmest on record, or maybe it was a relatively mild year given recent warming, and maybe it's only the third warmest on record. But it's this thing where every year in the last few decades, we've seen that estimates of global temperature suggest that it is the warmest or near warmest on record. And so what we can see is that when looking at sort of the average for sort of July temperatures, over the past 100+ years, that really it's been the last 40 to 50 years where we've seen significant warming on the order of about 1 degree centigrade increase in temperatures. And the challenge is that a lot of what is already emitted into the atmosphere and accumulated in terms of CO2 is starting to work through the system and will continue to warm given even current concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. And for that matter, a lot of the capital that we have around the world, our power plants, our manufacturing facilities, our buildings, our vehicles, when we think about just continuing to use them over their economic lifetime, that will likely contribute to more warming that's probably on the order of 1.5 to 2 degrees C. And it's at that temperature where a lot of the scientists, that amount of warming that the scientists have started to warn us about how catastrophic some of the impacts from climate change may be from around the world. And to sort of give you a sense of sort of what is the task ahead of us, if we're going to try to avoid some of those impacts, if we're going to cut warming, cut our emissions enough to stop warming to no more than 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, we're already more than halfway there. But if we were to do that, we're going to have to drive a dramatic deviation from what would otherwise likely be the continued growth of carbon dioxide emissions around the world. So this figure is showing our historic emissions. It's the same as what I showed a few slides ago when I paired it with the dates of the major UN climate negotiations. And we can see that the red line on the top is illustrating sort of what is the sort of best guess among major integrated assessment modelers, the community of modelers around the world who bring in an understanding of economics and population to try to characterize what might be the growth of those over time, how that then correlates to continued demand and growth in the consumption of energy and especially fossil fuel-based energy resources, and then integrate that with a scientific model to understand, well, what might be the impact this is going to have on temperatures in the global climate. And so they forecast without any new climate change policies, continued growth that looks similar to the growth we've experienced over the past 5 or 6 decades, with emissions finally sort of plateauing in the latter part of this century. But it's a huge increase in emissions in a world in which right now, if we're to limit warming to no more than 2 degrees C, we actually want to see global emissions start to go down and to go down quite substantially. And that's reflected by the gray line here in this figure. And in fact, if you look closely, you'll see that by 2070, 2075, these models suggest that globally our emissions of CO2 need to be negative. This reflects a lot of the really consequential innovation we need to commercialize technologies that not only can deliver energy and deliver power and deliver fuels with zero carbon emissions, but might also be a way to capture carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, pull it out of the atmosphere and put it in the ground as a part of the way we produce our energy and power. So it seems that in order for us to limit warming with at least a 50% chance, and this is, I'm giving you a 50% chance because there's enough uncertainties here. We're not really sure. This is our best understanding from the models, but it means that we have to dramatically reduce our emissions of CO2. And if we fail to do that, some of the impacts we might bear are reflected here in this slide. We can see at temperatures less than 2 degrees C, probably 1.5 degrees C, of significant damage to marine ecosystems like coral reefs, as reflected in the left-hand corner, upper left-hand corner slide here. And in fact, we're seeing some work being done right now in Australia where they're trying to cool the waters around the Great Barrier Reef as a way to try to protect that ecosystem. We've witnessed in recent years horrific fires, wildfires in California, in Australia, as a result of climate change. And this, in the top middle slide here, is presenting an image of that, of how horrific some of these wildfires have been. We can see in, say, South Beach, Miami, this is just a normal king tide. This just means it's a near full moon where you've got a high tide, and the waters are just flooding in across the major roadways there in the southern tip of Miami. If we go to the lower level here on the bottom left, we can think about the potential risk of a vector-borne disease such as malaria carried by mosquitoes may become more common as we think about a warming climate, and we may think about this with other vector-borne diseases that may pose major health risk. There's a big concern as well that as we have a changing climate, both warmer temperatures, changes in precipitation, it may adversely affect the productivity of farming. And of course, there's a concern about extreme weather events. In the bottom right, we're looking at an image of a typhoon, a major typhoon that hit Japan a couple of years ago that was quite catastrophic. But I think another thing that is going to be a problem is not just what are the physical impacts of climate change, but how do we think about the way our social systems and our political systems are organized to deal with these shocks to the system. And I think this is the thing that when I think about, and I know others who are thinking about this issue are concerned about what might be the potential for climate change to drive large-scale migration, especially when we look back on recent years, some of the political challenges we've had in thinking about migration, whether it's here in the United States with respect to migration from our south, whether we think about migration from Syria through different parts of Europe. In fact, there's some evidence suggesting that some of the Syrian migration was motivated, not just because of how to think about the civil war, but because of the risk posed by climate change when you think about the drought that they've been suffering in that country. So there's a question when you think about this, that locally in different parts of the world, we are likely to suffer catastrophic climate change impacts. It's not to say that I think that we're facing an existential threat because of climate change, but I think the kind of disruption to the way people live, to where people live, and to the ability of our political and social systems to deal with those kinds of shocks mean that we're likely to face quite catastrophic impacts from climate change in the near future. So the challenge then is, how do we think about responding to this? What is the policy response when we face some of these daunting risks posed by climate change? We've seen countries around the world start to announce rather ambitious emission reduction goals. So we've seen the European Union, the new Prime Minister in Japan, and of course, President Biden recently, all pledging to reduce emissions in those countries or in their regions to net zero by the year 2050. Similar goal by China by the year 2060. I think this is reflecting both a better understanding of the risk posed by climate change and the lack of progress we've made in the past decade. You know, the EU, Japan, the United States, a decade ago, and the run-up to the Copenhagen Conference of 2009, they were all calling for cutting emissions 80% by the year 2050. The problem is we haven't done enough over the past decade to cut emissions, and as the science has become more and more clear, we realize the risks posed by climate change are all the more dire. And so now we have even more ambitious goals to cut emissions, and cut emissions incredibly fast when we think about the nature of our economic and energy systems. You know, 30 years is an incredibly short period of time when you think about the lifetimes of power plants that may be 40 or 50 years, or manufacturing facilities that may be 20 to 30 years, vehicles that may be 10 to 15 years, or for that matter, when we think about some of our buildings and how we consume energy in our buildings, and some of our buildings are expected to last much longer than this 30-year window. So we've got a lot we have to do to change in our new investment, but think through as well about how we're going to be changing our existing capital stock in order to deliver on these goals. Now, there's three basic ways we can go about reducing emissions. The first is that we can raise the price of fossil fuel energy. So we can end up implementing policies that raise the price of coal, of oil, of natural gas, of the petroleum products. So that'd be one way to help discourage people from using these fossil fuels, getting them to switch to lower carbon and zero carbon sources of energy like renewables, like nuclear. But it would also induce them to become more energy efficient, to find ways to still realize the same energy services they want, but to do so by consuming less energy to do that. The second is we can think about through regulations. We can prescribe certain kinds of low or zero emission technologies through regulations. So maybe we could say, you want to build another coal-fired or natural gas-fired power plant, you can do that, but you have to use carbon capture and storage technology. You have to build in the equipment so that when you're burning the fossil fuel, we capture the CO2 when we put it in the ground so it doesn't contribute to climate change in the air. And third, we can think about ways we might subsidize investment in low and zero emission technologies. And so we've seen this through, say, tax credits or grants for wind power or solar power. And in fact, across the world, we see each of these being used. And in some countries, we see all of these being used, where they tax carbon pollution, they use aggressive regulations to prescribe specific technologies, and they use subsidies to bring in new zero carbon technologies into the marketplace. Now, the challenge is that from an economist standpoint, we may think that energy prices are too low. So this is from work that the International Monetary Fund has done to try to evaluate how we price fossil fuels relative to the way, if we were to fully account for their opportunity costs of production, fully account for their social costs in terms of their pollution that they emit, that we'd actually want to price them a lot more. And in fact, they estimate right now from fossil fuels that they emit about $1 trillion in climate change damages. That's not reflected in the price of fossil fuels. So the price of fossil fuels is way too low when we think about the climate change damages. It's also way too low when we think about the public health, the immediate public health damages from the air pollution. The fact that when we burn fossil fuels, we're putting fine particulates into the air. That's then contributing to premature mortality, especially among elderly populations around the world, among those who are have lower respiratory health, and among young children. So we're looking at trillions of dollars of damages from climate change, from local air pollution. When we burn fossil fuels, that's not reflected in their prices. So an economist looks at this and says, we should be pricing these social costs, make sure that the price of the fuel, the price of the energy that's brought to the market reflects these social costs, just like they reflect the cost of labor, the cost of materials, the cost of the inputs, the cost of running the factories. All that should go into the cost that you see reflected in the price of a good when you buy it in the market. Likewise, it should reflect these pollution externalities. Now, having said that, economists aren't very popular when we say energy prices are too low. That in practice, the public thinks energy prices are too high. So we can look through both in developing and developed countries, whether it's Nigeria in 2012. They had subsidized prices for petroleum products. They tried to raise their fuels. People took to the streets and protested. And Mexico in 2017, as a part of their energy system reform, the reform of the energy sector there in Mexico, they tried to raise fuel prices. People took to the streets and protested. The United Kingdom in 2000 had lorry strikes. The big truck drivers were not happy with how much the country was taxing diesel fuel. And so they started to strike, and they basically shut down all the major freeways in the UK by having these sort of slow driving lorry strikes where you'd have the trucks all lined up in a row and they'd drive at like 10 kilometers an hour there in the UK and just cause these massive traffic jams behind them as a way to protest. And then, of course, many of you probably remember the yellow vest protests in France in 2018 and 2019, when the country tried to raise the price of energy through a carbon tax on fuels. So the public thinks energy prices are too high, which then raises a question about whether or not we can use pricing policies as a way to combat climate change. So I'm going to make the case for why I still think there's a chance for doing that and why it's going to be important to deliver on these ambitious goals for us to use carbon pricing, raising energy prices to make that happen. The first is to think through the fundamental challenge that the government has if it's trying to direct the economy in a different way, in a way that is lower carbon emitting and eventually zero carbon emitting. How do we go about getting the economy to go in that direction? So the problem is that the state has a lot of questions because the government really lacks the information to really know what are the lowest cost ways and the most effective ways to reduce emissions throughout the economy. And part of this reflects a fundamental information problem. The government has less information about ways to reduce pollution, especially carbon dioxide emissions, than do the operators of power plants, the manufacturers of automobiles, the people who run major manufacturing facilities. And so that information problem is a question of like, how does the state go about designing regulations to address this, to ensure that we're getting significant emission reductions throughout all these different parts of our economy? And so the thing is, you could say there's an information problem and the government needs to sort of go out and study all these different sources of pollution and then try to be very prescriptive in what they mandate across all these different sources of pollution. But an alternative way to think about it is to say, instead of trying to solve the information problem for the state says, you in the private sector have more information than me. I understand your incentives. You like to make money. I'm going to change your incentives so that you can make more money. You can realize greater profits if you're reducing your pollution. So instead of trying to design regulations where we get the perfect information about all the different ways of reducing pollution, instead we're going to say, I'm going to give you the incentive in the private sector to go find out, solve the information problem on your own, seek out the lowest cost way of reducing pollution and make that happen. And so as a result, what we get is a kind of approach that is no longer technology specific. It's no longer, here's the technology you need to put on your tailpipe or you need to put on your smokestack. Instead, it's technology neutral. It says, I care about results. I care that you reduce emissions. I am going to measure your emissions. And I really don't care how you go about reducing your emissions. In fact, I may not even have the imagination to know the best way in your facility or in your production process to reduce emissions. But you now have an incentive to be creative and find that and to make it happen. So the thing too is we often see with regulations where we're being prescriptive, we're locking in what we know about today's technology. Whereas if we had an approach that said, all I care about are results, and I'm going to give you an incentive to go find those results, that's going to induce a lot more innovation, get a lot more adoption of breakthrough technologies that help us move quickly down both the cost and the efficacy of technologies that can limit CO2 emissions so that we can really make progress towards those ambitious goals for mid-century. Now, there's, I think, also a concern that because we have been using regulations, we have been using subsidies, that we're now starting to experience some diminishing returns. First, because of the success in building out wind power and solar power, especially here in the United States, we have 100 times more solar capacity today than we did in 2008. We have about 4 times as much wind power capacity today as we did in 2008. They are becoming a larger and larger fraction of our grid, of our generation mix. And for that matter, they represent the biggest investments we've made in the power sector generation since 2008. But the thing is, subsidies get more and more expensive for us as we're increasing more and more our clean energy development and deployment. So the thing is that we're actually still spending a lot of money on these. And if we're going to really try to make the power system almost exclusively renewable, it gets really expensive to do this just through subsidies. Second, when we think about regulations, I do have some concerns about the composition of federal courts after 4 years of Trump administration appointees. And there are a lot of people who are experts in administrative law who share this concern about whether or not the courts may step in and limit some of the ambition we try to pursue through regulations as they try to limit some of the discretionary authority among environmental and energy regulators in the federal government. And finally, I would say that industry-specific and technology-specific approaches, which is typically a defining characteristics of either subsidies, we get subsidies for very specific categories of technologies, characteristics of a lot of our regulations where we're very specific about what industry they apply to, in fact, what technologies you may be able to use to comply with those regulations. I think they're very poorly suited for the emerging energy economy. We've typically had an approach where we say, here's what we're going to do to vehicles, and here's what we're going to do to power plants. The thing is, in a world in which we have electric vehicles, that sort of wall between those two industries is starting to fall. We typically say, here's what we're going to do for, say, new appliances or for buildings. Here's what we're going to do over here for power plants. But if we think we're going to be in a world in which we're going to do more and more of our heating through electricity with heat pumps, as opposed with natural gas or heating oil, we're again breaking down that wall that has traditionally existed between these industries. So I think as we see the opportunities for more competition across different parts of the energy economy, we want to have a level playing field policy-wise across all of these sectors that is technology neutral, that's going to create the right incentives for low-cost technologies to come in and deliver the results we care about, which are lower emissions of carbon dioxide. I think there has been some support for carbon pricing. In 2014, the World Bank organized a pricing carbon declaration. 73 countries, not the United States in that group, but 73 countries and more than 1,000 companies signed on to this declaration that emphasized the importance of pricing carbon as a major tool for combating climate change. In 2019, more than 3,500 economists signed on to a statement to support carbon dividends. The idea that we would actually tax carbon dioxide pollution, we would take the revenues raised from that tax and we would return it to households through regular rebates. It's hard to get 3,000 economists to agree on anything. So this is a sign that, like, at least the economics community think this is a great way to move forward with carbon pricing. I will also note, though, that none of these economists actually have a vote in Congress. Finally, I'll note that national governments around the world have said we are going to use carbon pricing as a way to implement the pledges we made under the 2015 Paris Agreement. And more than half the world's emissions are represented by these countries that do intend to use carbon pricing. And I think there's an opportunity here for us to experiment with the policy and demonstrate how it can work that makes it more and more appealing to emerging and developing countries as they ramp up their domestic policy programs for combating climate change. So let me sort of illustrate quickly some two models of carbon pricing. One is a so-called cap and trade program. And the primary example of this is the EU emission trading scheme that's been around since 2005. It sets an aggregate emissions cap. and that cap on emissions falls over time. That gives you sort of the quantitative limit on how much carbon dioxide is allowed among all the sources that are covered by the program. You take that aggregate cap and you divide it into emission allowances, and each allowance gives you the right to emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide. You can auction the allowances and raise revenues, or you could give the allowances away for free, and they've done a mix of this in the EU. And so that's how the allowances get out into the private economy among those sources that are regulated by the program. And those sources of emissions at the end of every year have to hold enough allowances to cover their emissions for that year. But what's important is that there's a secondary market that emerges. These facilities that are covered by the program can buy and sell these emission allowances over time. If you start to innovate in your facility and you're like, hey, it's pretty cheap for us to reduce our emissions, you can undertake those low cost emissions abatement investments and then sell some allowances you don't need, and you make money doing that. It becomes sort of a new product for your company. Likewise, you might do some studies around your facility and say, wow, it's really expensive to reduce our emissions. It may be cheaper for us to go buy an allowance from someone else who's really cheap at making that. And that way it actually lowers our costs for complying with the policy. And so we see where a market for pollution emerges that helps create incentives to seek out the lowest cost ways of reducing pollution among those sources covered by the market. The tax and dividend approach, which I just mentioned, what has been proposed by the Climate Leadership Council, which is sort of a group initially among some sort of Republican elder statesmen, but is quite bipartisan in nature now. They have initially argued for an economy-wide carbon tax of $40 a ton. That'll be applied on all the coal and oil and natural gas in the economy. And in fact, given the existing way we run our tax code, would be very simple to administer through the tax code. We're already collecting all the information for coal and oil that would be covered by this carbon tax. You're literally adding one line to a tax form for those sources. A little bit more work for natural gas, but administratively would be quite simple to implement. It'd be based on their carbon content of fossil fuels, not measuring how much CO2 is actually going into the air when we burn it, but recognizing that any coal we burn, we can estimate with a high degree of precision the CO2 going in the atmosphere. Likewise, for a given unit of natural gas or a given unit of petroleum products. We can then take the revenues raised by the tax and return it to households on a per capita basis, and I'll illustrate this with some analysis in a few slides. And they would increase the carbon tax over time so that you could drive down significant emission reductions over time. We've seen carbon pricing policies adopted around the world. Every year, the World Bank issues a trends in carbon pricing report where they see countries implementing cap and trade or a carbon tax. Sometimes they're using both approaches on different industries in their economy. And actually, some of the designs end up being more of a kind of hybrid design. So like here in Massachusetts, our power sector is covered by the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This is a cap and trade program for carbon dioxide in the power sector for Massachusetts and about 10 other states. That program has an auction of emission allowances. And if the price is in the auction ends up being low, you actually hit the floor price in the auction. That basically converts what is a cap and trade program into an emissions tax. So it has this kind of guarantee that you have to pay at least a certain price in the auction. That's going to encourage then emission reductions in the covered sources in the power sector in these states. But if the price is above that floor, then it operates with this sort of cap and trade characteristic where it's going to depend on the buying and selling of allowances to determine what's the price that these sources face, and hence how strong is that incentive for further reducing their emissions. But you can see here the interest certainly across many OECD countries, across Europe, North America, developed Asia, but also more and more the large emerging economies are moving forward with various kinds of carbon pricing instruments. So right now around the world, we have about 20% of the world's CO2 emissions are covered by either cap and trade program of one form or another, or by a price-based approach like a carbon tax. And it's also interesting to think about how common these approaches are for addressing energy and environmental issues in the United States. Basically, no one in the country can actually flip a light switch or fill up their car without using energy that is in some way subject to a kind of cap and trade or tradable performance standard, which has a lot of the same characteristics as cap and trade, as a way of delivering on a preferred environmental outcome with that energy source. So as I noted, we have cap and trade programs in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states. Also, the state of California has one. We have about 30 states have state renewable portfolio standards that are a kind of tradable performance standard that requires a certain percentage of your power to come from renewable sources. We have to address conventional air pollutants, the cross-state air pollution rule that also allows some trading among sources. We have across the entire country a renewable fuel standard that mandates biofuels in the gasoline and diesel we consume, and that is the implementation and the compliance for it allows refineries to buy and sell the generation of biofuels as the basis for their compliance. We have to address benzene, a carcinogen in gasoline. We have a credit trading program among refineries here as we reduce the amount of benzene in these fuels, and likewise, a similar kind of credit trading program among refineries that reduces the sulfur content in gasoline. And finally, we have in California a low carbon fuel standard that builds on and is a little bit more advanced than the national biofuels mandate through the renewable fuel standard. So in general, what we see is most states have multiples of these kinds of programs. And so they're quite common in how we are now producing energy around the country. We've also seen interest in the private sector in actually using a price on carbon in their internal planning. So more and more major companies, whether it's in manufacturing like GM or Owens Corning, whether it's in the financial sector like BNY, whether it's in the energy sector like ExxonMobil and Exelon, whether it's in IT like Google or Microsoft, we're seeing more and more companies use an internal carbon price to inform their investment decisions, to inform their long-term strategy, and something where it also reflects, I think, a growing anticipation that they're going to see more and more aggressive carbon pricing policies in the markets they operate in the coming years. So let me describe briefly some of the carbon pricing impacts before wrapping up with a few questions for you to think about more generally our approach to mitigating climate change risk. First, if we were to implement something like what the Climate Leadership Council has proposed of $40 a ton CO2, and to put that in context, that means something like about a 35-cent per gallon increase in the price of gasoline. So it's something that people would notice. If your electricity came exclusively from coal, that would increase the price of your electricity quite substantially. But I'll acknowledge coal's share in the US power system has come down so much now that we are consuming less than half as much coal today as we were a decade ago for generating electricity. But we'd probably see from $40 a ton, that would increase electricity prices something on the order of 1 to 2 cents a kilowatt hour in different parts of the country. But it would dramatically ramp down our emissions. And so this is showing how you could cut emissions throughout the entire economy by more than 50% by the year 2035, well below what was the US Paris Agreement commitment that President Obama pledged in 2015, and continue to drive down emissions even beyond 2035. So you get significant improvement in the environment from implementing such an approach. When we think about the economic cost, some of my colleagues at Resources for the Future have a really nice carbon pricing calculator that you can sort of play with to learn about some of the impacts of different climate change policies under consideration. And so this is here sort of showing what we might expect from GDP. And I will acknowledge in their analysis, they did not take into account COVID for the year 2020. So where this is sort of excluding the recent shock by COVID, but it shows here what I think is generally held by economic models and our understanding. And for that matter, even looking backwards now, our statistical analysis of carbon pricing in practice, it really doesn't have much of an impact on overall economic activity or GDP. And so this is showing the difference between a $40 a ton carbon price and no climate change policy in the United States. And you're really talking about achieving a level of economic activity, of economic output GDP, a few months later than expected, if you were to go from a no climate policy scenario to a $40 a ton carbon tax that increases over time. So it does have an impact on economic output, but it's very small in the aggregate. When we think about the distributional impacts, there are a lot of people who are concerned that if we're going to raise energy prices, that disproportionately harms low-income households. They tend to spend a larger fraction of their budgets on energy. And so any policy that raises their energy costs could be disproportionately harmful for them. But this is some work done by the Treasury Department at the very end of the Obama administration, where they found that if you were to have a tax coupled with a rebate program, so you took all those revenues and returned them, and every person in the country got the same check coming back to them, then the population in the lowest 70% of the income distribution are actually going to be better off. They're actually going to have higher incomes relative to what they'd have to be paying out more for their energy or for the energy embodied in the goods and services they consume. It's only the very highest income brackets would actually see a decline when they thought about the combined impact of both the tax on the carbon embedded in the energy they consume and the rebates they receive. Now, I think this also could play a key role when we think about the leadership or the reestablishment of leadership for the United States in engaging countries around the world on climate change. Certainly during the Trump years, the United States advocated leadership on global climate change policy. And I think, there's cautious optimism around the world for the Biden administration, but they really want to see what we're doing at home. Climate policy in the United States has been a yo-yo for the last several decades. And so there's a concern about the durability of any kind of approach that the Biden administration would take. But I think that if you're able to demonstrate serious, durable domestic climate policy efforts, that makes it easier for the United States to reestablish its role as a leader on this issue. I'd also note that we have some precedent for this, that in 2014, in the run-up to the 2015 Paris conference, the US and China had made an unprecedented bilateral agreement that really created a lot of positive momentum towards the 2015 Paris conference. And that bilateral agreement was primarily based on strong domestic actions. And I think if we were to see something like that now going forward, that would help to sort of rebuild the momentum we need for action in the international sphere. Now, the political economy of this, there's in a sense here that what I've been describing is a kind of great swap. It's this idea that we want to put a tax on carbon and we're going to return revenues to households. So you're going to end up paying more for some of your fossil-based energy, but you're going to get rebates in exchange. There's also some who say you ought to couple this with reducing regulatory burdens. And that way you can build some support among the right by reducing the regulatory state, but still driving significant climate change policy. I think the challenge here is how do we think about the mix of winners and losers and the use of revenues to build a sufficiently large political coalition so that this could be a viable path forward. There's also a question about what role this could play in a Green New Deal. We've seen, I think, incredible enthusiasm brought into this debate by many progressives over the last few years about how to make efforts in addressing climate change part of a larger agenda to promote social justice. There's a question about whether or not a carbon tax could be a way to craft some kind of bipartisan support for ambitious climate policy consistent with the Green New Deal. It may be a way in which we take some of the revenues that go back to households, but some may also go to help finance infrastructure, to build out some of the infrastructure investment we know we need. It may also be a way to ensure that we're able to strive for more ambitious goals, that making sure we're getting the biggest bang for our buck through cost-effective policy in the near term as we start a path on more ambitious climate policy in the United States. Let me close with a couple of questions here. I know you have questions for me, but I'm going to start by asking you a few questions. One is this question about whether or not a democracy can price carbon high enough to decarbonize the economy. We have a very ambitious goal. Putting a price on carbon makes quite salient the ambition that's needed, but it also creates, I think, a target politically for those who benefit from the status quo, from incumbents who've enjoyed a kind of free ride by not having to pay the full social cost of their fossil fuel combustion and consumption. And so there's a question about whether or not we can actually get sufficient support in a democratic form of government to actually get the price of carbon high enough to deliver on these ambitious goals. There's a corollary to this, is whether we can do any suite of policies ambitious enough to deliver on these goals. The next question is whether a US carbon pricing policy can enable it to reestablish global leadership so we can get enough countries to take on even more ambitious action going forward. We could cut our emissions to zero tomorrow, but if we don't get enough other countries around the world to take that action, then we're still going to see temperatures go well beyond 2 degrees C, which of course is the concern countries have had about the United States over the past 4 years. It didn't matter if they all went to zero. If we had a kind of Trump administration approach to energy policy, we would continue to see climate damages for the foreseeable future. There's a question, I think, politically about whether our carbon pricing could work in a Green New Deal. And then there's this big question. I framed this talk as, how do we sort of save the planet cost effectively? Is carbon pricing going to be enough to save the planet? And are mitigation policies designed to mitigate emissions, going to be enough to save the planet? So I'll close with sort of thinking about a little bit of a broader approach. I've been focusing on the energy system, on cutting our emissions, but I think we need to take seriously a three-pronged approach to climate policy. One is to redouble our efforts on emission mitigation. We know we need to do a lot more here. We need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and eventually we need negative net emissions, and that means pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. Second, we need to get more and more serious about adaptation, to make those investments in our resilience to the climate shocks that are coming, so that for a given level of climate change, we can reduce our damages. And then amelioration. And here I think what we're talking about is reducing climate change for a given level of atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. And what I'm talking about here is the prospect of something like solar geoengineering. The idea we may put particles into the upper atmosphere deflect some of the incoming sunlight, and as a result, offset some of the warming caused by the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere by having this cooling effect by putting particles in the upper atmosphere. This is something that's getting more and more consideration in policy circles. Certainly more and more research is being done in the science and engineering circles. It's one that gives a lot of people in the policy debate, though, considerable cause about the nature of this kind of approach of a massive world experiment, if you will, to address and combat climate change. So I'm going to sort of close this with sort of a graphical illustration of this, that we think about sort of the role of economic growth and technological innovation. They contribute to emissions. The emissions contribute to our warming temperatures. The temperatures contribute to the climate change impacts. And then when we think about the role of policy and recognizing that the impacts feed back in and may even slow economic growth, may even cause economies to decline over time. When we think about the role of policy through R&D, we can promote greater technological innovation. We can use mitigation policies like pricing carbon to reduce our emissions. We can use something like solar radiation management, solar geoengineering to offset the temperature. And we can use adaptation to reduce those adverse impacts. But there's a lot of uncertainties here. And I think that's why it's important for us to take a kind of act, learn, act approach to sort of iterate on mitigation policies, solar radiation management, and adaptation as a part of a three-pronged climate strategy. But the timing here is really critical. We got to get moving now to make it happen. But I think there's a lot of innovative activity available on all these fronts, so that if we actually get serious and move public policy in the right direction, we think about using carbon pricing to mitigate our emissions. We think about making really thoughtful investments to ensure that more and more people are resilient to the shocks of a changing climate, to think about the opportunities for solar radiation management to better manage these risks as we start to resolve some of the uncertainties. We'll be up to the challenge of climate change. But it is going to require a lot of effort by our policymakers, by stakeholders, by the business community, by civil society, and by you and me to make this happen. So I appreciate again the opportunity to be with you here today, and I look forward to the discussion here in our final minutes. Thanks again.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to start with one of the questions that was in the chat from John Little. And it says, can you explain more about the point that subsidies become more expensive as clean energy deployment increases?
Right, so part of it is that when we look at the approach that we've taken here in the United States for wind subsidies, we pay about 2.5 cents for every kilowatt hour of power we produce from wind. We've been paying the same subsidy for wind power since 1992. And so the thing is, now that we have a lot more wind farms today operating than we did in the past, and that we're bringing more and more wind farms online every year than we've done in any year in the past, that just means that as we want to go from what was a very small amount, less than 1% of our power generation coming from wind, to now the potential to getting up to about 10% of power generation, to thinking that by 2035, we may want to have 40 or 50% of our power to come from wind, that if we're paying 2.5 cents for every kilowatt hour, that's now getting a lot more expensive than when we first designed these subsidies. And I would say there's ways we can try to tailor the subsidies and be a little bit more efficient. You know, we don't have to, I don't think we have to pay as much for new wind like we did in the past, given how the cost of the technology have come down a lot. But the problem is that we're not very good at targeting, and the political economy, this makes it hard. We're not very good at targeting our subsidies to those investments that really need it. That if they didn't get the subsidy, they would not happen, but with the subsidy, they do happen. That's the kind of sweet spot you want for a subsidy policy, but that runs counter to the political economy, where you want the subsidy even if it's not critical or marginal towards your investment. And I think that political economy is why it would continue to get more and more expensive if we don't change our subsidy regime.
Thank you. I'm going to read. So one of the questions that I had was in regard to climate policy. And so obviously we have the Biden administration here. And so what are you really hopeful from them in the next 4 years will see occur? And then not only the policies that you think will actually get implemented, but what will be those long-term impacts?
So I think, you know, when I look at the climate challenge, we need every part of our economy, every part of our society to start moving forward in addressing climate change. And when I think about what's the role then of government, it starts with recognizing that basically everything government does can have an impact on the climate. And so what we are seeing now that gives me a lot of optimism in the Biden administration is that they are taking seriously what has been described as a whole of government approach to climate change. It's recognizing that it's not just going to be EPA and say the Department of Energy that's going to help us solve this problem. It's going to be the SEC doing financial disclosures in their regulatory approach to what publicly traded companies have to say about their climate change risks that they face. It's the Secretary of the Treasury working with the investment community and with CEOs around the country and around the world saying, we need each of you to get more serious about climate change as we get more serious here in the federal government. It's recognizing that as we think about the potential risk that climate change poses to those in, say, low-income housing, that the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development gets more serious about how they approach climate change in their policy agenda. So I think the starting point here to make it clear that climate change matters in everything the federal government does, because climate change is going to affect us everywhere in our economy and throughout our society. And so I think if we can get that sort of built in throughout our approach, we can get that part of also our communication to the country, to the public, and to key stakeholders. I think that gives you the kind of foundation for a much more serious approach to climate change and a much more ambitious approach that can actually have, I think, quite an important legacy when we think about what happens in the future, regardless of what's done negotiating with Congress on the next piece of legislation, or what may be the next regulation that EPA promulgates to try to address the emissions of CO2. But it's the starting point right now that makes me quite optimistic is saying we recognize that every part of our economy is going to be impacted by climate change. If we're going to decarbonize our economy, every part of our economy has to change and adjust to this new world. And that means we need to use every tool throughout the federal government to try to make that happen.
All right, so I'm going to look at a question from James Storms. He's asking, what have been the effects of the COVID lockdowns on the environment, and what have we learned that could continue post-COVID?
So I would say there's a couple sort of near-term effects, and then there's one longer-term that's quite important. The near-term effects are actually mixed. In one sense, we saw people weren't driving nearly as much. We weren't using our factories quite as much. We actually saw power demand down. We actually saw our emissions of CO2 for the year 2020 down quite significantly. There's a potential downside with that, is that we also weren't investing quite as much in new lower carbon or zero carbon technologies. That if one thing is we want a strong enough economy so that we are turning over our capital stock and getting in a lot of this lower and zero carbon technologies and equipment and manufacturing capacity and power plants into operation. So there's a question about, in 2020, we had dramatically lower emissions. We may end up with slightly higher emissions in 21, 22, as the economy rebounds, and we haven't made quite as much of that investment that we really needed. To me, the long-term question, and it is one that does give me pause, is that the world didn't work well together managing COVID. And when I think about, COVID is going to end up being a brutal couple of years for the world. And we certainly didn't work together well at the very beginning. And in fact, if anything, a lot of countries just started shutting down their borders, but they were also shutting down information flow. That would have been really quite important early on in how we manage this and learn from each other to try to do a better job in managing this. We also saw, I think, an incredibly frustrating role for disinformation that has had major public health consequences, which is actually a lousy euphemism for death. And I think it's the combination of not really working well together and within different countries having disinformation actually undermine the policy response. Gives me pause to how we're going to deal with what is not going to be a couple of year major shock, but what is going to be a multi-decade, I think, series of shocks associated with climate change, and how we as a global community are going to learn to try to work together or not in managing those risks. So I think there's sort of the near term, which is kind of mixed. We did reduce our pollution in the near term, might have slowed down some of the investment we need in lower carbon technologies. But I think it's a question mark about whether or not the long term is we actually respond and say we got to do a lot better when the world faces a common shock. And when we think about the common shocks coming at us from climate change, we got to work better together on that. Or whether or not this is just a signal of what is going to be a very nationalistic and dysfunctional approach to climate shocks in the future.
Right, and then I also had a question of my own about the political feasibility of these policies. So I was reading, and I've seen that some summaries say that it could be an increase of 30% in the fiscal year 2022 budget to implement those climate policies. And obviously with a Senate that's split 50-50 between Republicans and Democrats, what sort of what other policies could the US government undertake to get not only politicians more on board with these policies, but the American populace as well?
So we're getting a dry run of that right now as we think about this American Rescue Plan. I think that's what we're calling the ARP, the nearly $2 trillion that President Biden has proposed. And he's going around the country and selling it. And he's selling it as bipartisan because he looks at the polling of the public, not the statements of elected officials in DC. And I think that's going to be interesting to see whether or not that has any influence on the politicals, because this plan seems to poll fairly well. It certainly polls better with the public than it does with Republicans in the US Senate. And so the question is whether or not that ends up being a successful political strategy here over the next month. That also takes advantage of one of the key institutions, which is in the Senate. If you want to do a major tax and spending package, you can do that through a so-called reconciliation approach. So this is where you only need 51 votes. It's not subject to the filibuster, so long as it focuses on taxes or on spending. The challenge is it doesn't give you new regulatory authorities, and you might think you want new regulatory authorities potentially to address climate change. This is something we looked at in 2009 when I was in the Obama administration. You couldn't do cap and trade, which is our primary approach to trying to address climate change back in 2009. You probably couldn't do that through this reconciliation vehicle. It's just the nature of the rules. That's more of a regulatory authority, and that's not considered to be permissible through this approach. But I think there's a sense here from from President Biden and from his team in the White House. This is important. This has the public support. We're going to move forward with it. And then I think what they're going to do next is probably infrastructure, which is where you're going to see a lot of the potential spending related to energy and climate change. And if they see that polling well, they're going to push for it. And I don't think they care if it means getting a 51-50 vote in the Senate, if they think it's polling really well with the public. And at some point, there's going to be a question about whether or not you want government to act or not act, and whether or not you actually like the actions the government is undertaking. So I think there's a question here about whether or not there can be some near-term success. And in politics, momentum means a lot. And if there's a way in which they can get near-term success on this, that seems to poll well with the public, then maybe that makes it easier to get the next piece of legislation moved through. It is difficult. I mean, in 2009, we had a much larger majority in the House. We had nearly 60 votes in the Senate when we passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the major stimulus bill that year. It was still quite hard politically because some people just didn't want to spend that much money. It's a lot cheaper to actually spend dollars today in the federal government because it's so cheap to borrow money to finance this spending. But the politics of passing and voting on $1 trillion plus bills are still a little bit difficult. It's a price tag that makes some members of Congress a little bit anxious. And it makes some of the people who finances their campaigns a little bit anxious. So I think there are going to be some questions about how does President Biden deliver on what was, without a doubt, the most ambitious climate change program that any major party candidate for president had ever run on. Certainly, Senator Sanders had a more ambitious program in the primary, but in terms of the general election, we've never seen someone with as ambitious a program as what President Biden had proposed. But to deliver on that, he's got to make some progress with Congress. And so we'll see. We'll start to get a sense of the viability of that program, I think, by these initial votes we'll see over the coming weeks for the COVID recovery plan.
All right, well, thank you so much. Sorry for any questions we didn't get to. We're just gonna have one more. And this is just a general question. Obviously, there are a lot of seniors who are graduating and going into a world where it's a little bit scary what kind of jobs we're gonna get. But what would your advice be for students that really wanna make a big impact, particularly in the environmental career field?
So one thing I will say is I think the economy is going to pick up a lot this year, and especially into 22. But I think the second half of this year, we're going to see like a lot of economic recovery. I think we're going to hopefully, I look forward to participating more fully in the economy outside of my home, as I'm sure many of us want to and look forward to. And I think the vaccination efforts will help make that happen. So I think the economy is going to be going in the right direction. I think if we get this major spending bill passed, that's going to help grow the economy as well and create more opportunities in the economy. I think one thing that is great about wanting to get into and think about a career where you can make the world better, there are a lot of opportunities to do that now. I mean, it used to be like when I was coming out of college, it meant, you go work for like a local nonprofit, or maybe you go work in government. But there are a lot of companies that are really serious about what they can do to combat climate change, what they're going to do to ensure that they're going to be part of the solution. That creates opportunities for you to even go, you're not selling out when you go work at a company. You can actually have a really positive impact on the world. In fact, I've talked to people in the energy industry where they realize one of the motivations for why their senior leadership, starting with the CEO, have said, we need to get serious about what we're going to do to contribute to the effort on climate change, is it helps them recruit better workers. They know that your generation, this matters. It's not just, do I get a paycheck? Is that, do I get a paycheck knowing I'm going to make the world better? And so I'm actually quite optimistic about what the opportunities are, whether it's in a local business, whether it's in a multinational corporation, whether it's working in government, working in civil society. There are a lot of different opportunities here to make a difference on how we're going to deal with climate change and deal with the shocks posed by climate change, but also what we're going to do moving the ball forward to ensure that we're mitigating climate change risk as much as possible in the way we change the way we consume energy, how we change the way we use our land, which has an impact, which I didn't really talk about in our remarks. So I think there's a lot of opportunities here. And I am optimistic about where I think our economy is going. So I know it's been a long year for everybody, and it's got to be a tough year as one is finishing up college, to finish it up over Zoom. But I think I'm optimistic about the days that are ahead. I'm optimistic about what your generation is going to do on this too. I really am. It is an exciting time to be a professor, and to be energized and challenged by your generation, and to be excited about what kind of impact you're going to have when you leave our campuses.
Yeah, I mean, firsthand, I have seen an absolutely amazing campus that I know we have had here that's already had an impact even at college. But thank you so much for speaking with us. And I'm sure all the students and faculty greatly enjoyed you and appreciated you coming here and speaking for us today. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else has as well. And hopefully I will bring this to my family and educate them as well, and bring it through my career and make huge impacts. But thank you so much. And thank you again.
Thank you, Renee. Thank you, Joe. Really appreciate it.